Good afternoon and morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Understanding Shifts in Commuting Behavior and Mobility Networks in American Cities. We have an esteemed panelist group here today that will be presenting shortly. But prior to us beginning with that presentation, I'd like to just take a couple of moments to introduce all of you back into LAI and what our mission and goal for LAI is, and LEF, which is really the heart and foundation of the research endeavors that are going on within its institution. I wanted to point you to the QR code and put in a shameless advertisement that we are still accepting applications for grant submissions. If you use the QR code, and if you could submit by the end of March, there is still the opportunity to receive a grant funding from LEF. And moving forward, many of you have seen the events and the e-blasts that have been coming up. Just as a quick reminder, we do have our gatherings in September in Montreal. And if you want to sign up for it, it would be great. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is turn this over to Constantine Kostanasta and have him introduce the webinar as well as his panelists.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. I'm just going to share my screen so we have that ready. Okay. And just to follow on with introductions, it is it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to present some of our ongoing work that has been generously funded by the Land Economics Foundation as well as the NYU Center for Urban Science and Progress. My colleagues on this project are Professor Sally Angel, a professor of urban planning at NYU Marin Institute, and has done incredible work on urbanization across the globe that many of you, I'm sure, have seen or have come across. Bartosz Bunzak is a research scientist with my lab at NYU Marin Institute, and also a PhD candidate in urban systems at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering. And I'm an associate professor of urban science and planning at NYU Marin, also at the Center for Urban Science and Progress and the Department of Civil and Urban Engineering. I also direct the Civic Analytics program at the Marin Institute and the Urban Intelligence Lab. So without further ado, we'll just hop into the presentation. Excuse me, I have a little delay here. So just before we get into the topic for today, I just wanted to give a little bit of introduction to the work that we're doing in our lab, and just talk about how that ties back in some of the projects we've been working on. So our focus is on using high-resolution, large-scale data and various computational methods to understand urban dynamics in multiple forms. And so we would do a lot of work around data-driven decision-making and using these tools to better understand sustainability and resilience in cities, energy and climate change and climate mitigation in cities, and issues of neighborhood change and social justice as well. So we've benefited from funding and collaborations with a range of federal, state, local sources and private sector as well. A lot of our work involves collaborations and partnerships with city agencies, with government agencies. And this really enhances the kind of translation of the research from the more fundamental kind of research aspects to practice. And I also just want to highlight kind of a key aspect here of what's so important and what's going on right now in this context, both in terms of research and practice in the study of cities. Of course, everyone is very familiar with what's happening with artificial intelligence. There's no shortage of discussions around the implications of ChatGPT and large language models in general, and what's going to happen more broadly in society as a result of those advancements, but also in terms of the machine learning and computational models that are another component of artificial intelligence. So that's one aspect of our work, is bringing those models and those approaches into the study of cities. The other is just the change in the cadence and the coverage and the resolution of the kind of data that are now available, where historically planners real estate professionals, others were relying on census data or survey data. Now we're getting to the point where we're looking at this near real-time data around, of course, as we'll get much more into mobility data, so geolocation data, transactional data, all kinds of information about what's happening in the city. So the issue that we grapple with is how to, process this and make sense of it and feed that into some of the research that we're doing. Our research covers four broad areas. And I'll just talk about three of the areas that we're not discussing today, just to give some examples of the nature of the things that we're doing. So one area that we do a lot of work in is bias and fairness and algorithmic decision-making in the public sector. So we've done work, for instance, around looking at citizen or resident complaint reports, and fairness issues and how those complaint reports are used to then allocate city services, for instance. Done a number of work around energy efficiency and climate action in cities, with New York and many others. So on the left here is our visualization tool that is the official tool for New York City. New York City's energy benchmarking data. So this tool, if you go to the link there, will allow you to look at the energy and carbon and water emissions for every building that has to report that information in New York City. And so that's about 30,000 buildings. And then much other research looking at how do we think about grading energy buildings for energy use, for instance, and also energy cost burdens. So multiple facets of looking at energy efficiency in cities. And then the last component is more broadly around using AI for city management. So this involves some work, for instance, that we've done with homeless shelters to understand the likelihood of return of a family leaving a homeless shelter back into the system. Looking at the implications of street trees and urban greenery on health-related and respiratory-related illness. And then working even with sanitation department to figure out better ways of routing trucks to limit emissions and optimize trash collection. So a whole host of really kind of, I think, really interesting topics, but all coming from this component and this perspective of bringing data and machine learning tools together on some of these pressing urban challenges. So the focus today, again, is on understanding in a very different way, or hopefully what we think is a new way of trying to understand what were the implications and what are the implications of both the pandemic and kind of the post-pandemic working arrangements and working labor relations. What are the implications of this for the spatial structure of cities? So we're particularly focused on looking at how these new relations have changed commuting behavior into traditional economic centers of cities or commercial districts of cities, but also understanding this from a network perspective. So understanding the relationship between residential and work locations and how those are beginning to shift over time, and what we could learn from the past few years about what might persist into the future. So the outline for today is we'll just go through some of our research questions and objectives, talk in some depth about the data and methodology, because I think it is an important part of the work that we've done, and I think a relatively new data set looking at these cell phone derived geolocation data, and then get into the results and some of our conclusions and future work. So just kind of the motivation for this, I mean, there's been no shortage of discussion about the implications of the pandemic for commercial downtowns and for cities in general. Discussions of the doom loop, for instance, and just the hollowing out of traditional urban cores, particularly in kind of the larger, more established cities. And to some degree, this has played out over the last few years in varying degrees. You could see on the bottom right here is just data from Moody's looking at vacancy rates in CBDs versus suburban office areas over the last 5 years. And so there's obviously tremendous discussion about what are the implications of the potential impact on CBDs for cities. Obviously, these are important economic generators, they're important tax revenue generators, and just really key to the kind of activity and liveliness that makes an important part of kind of city life. So we really wanted to understand a little bit more about what was shaping this in terms of the actual mobility patterns of people commuting to work, how those were starting to shift, and what could we learn about both the resilience of economic centers or employment centers. What are the characteristics that might suggest, resilience and some recovery over time? And what can we learn about perhaps more persistent structural changes in the spatial configuration of cities? So as I mentioned, our motivation is really about understanding what these changes, remote work as an important component of this, and work from home more broadly. What do these changing kind of labor relations and work arrangements, what will these potentially, what areas will these affect, and what types of cities, and what parts within cities will these most rapidly affect? And how does this also tie back to residential locations as well? And so our questions are really focused around these areas. So, first off, just understanding how mobility patterns are shifting in response to kind of these changing work patterns. Also fundamental things around how do we define employment centers in the first place, and what are the associations between changes in commuting behavior and various characteristics of both the employment center and where people are commuting from. And then can we develop some measures of resilience for employment centers that we could carry forward to look at the potential impact on commercial areas in future kind of exogenous shocks? So our data, as I mentioned, as I'll get into a lot more depth in a minute, is really focused on large-scale geolocation mobility data derived from cell phones. And this is come from a data provider called Advan. There are multiple data sources for this type of data that are out there at very different types of resolutions. So our data covers from 2018 to 2013. And it's housed around, or its coverage is focused on the spatial unit of the census block group. So we have some aggregation, which is useful for the study at hand, and also enhances some of the privacy preserving features of what we're trying to do, so that we're not looking at individual cell phone data in our study in this case. We also then tie this together with network analysis techniques and machine learning approaches, as I'll talk about, and then we'll get into some of the results. So just to try and frame what this looks like in the end, and then come back to how we got this. This is a map of the network connections so the kind of homework connections, those commutes, across 803 identified employment centers across approximately 190 MSAs in the US. So the blue lines are activities that as of 2019, and the red are activities that are more from 2022. And I will get into all what this means, but this is ultimately kind of the output that we have in terms of building this homework commute structure across the United States. Even from this simple visualization, we could start to see kind of the red popping up in these smaller MSAs, these more localized commuting behaviors and patterns, and increasing commuting activity, in some of these, smaller MSAs. But we'll dig into this. But I wanted to kind of show at a higher level kind of what the results look like in terms of dealing with what we are able to put together from these types of mobility data. So just to take a moment to get into this, and I understand that everyone watching this may have a kind of a different level of interest and facility with these types of data, but I did want to introduce them because I think they are an important tool for planning and real estate as we move forward. So as I mentioned, these are coming from Advan data, and so these are essentially providing us counts of visits between CBGs. So there'll be a home CBG that is defined by an algorithm that Advan has developed that's based on the location of a device overnight for over a period of time. And that then assigns a device a home location, a residential location, and then commutes into or trips into other CBGs. And we're able to define here kind of work-related trips based on their frequency and the time of those commuting time of day of those actual trips. But essentially, we're looking at a home location, a work location CBG, and the number of trips between them, and we are aggregating that from hourly up to monthly to kind of monthly counts. And so what we're able to do then with these data is translate them into an origin destination matrix so that we are able to kind of analyze and create a network of where these commutes are taking place and how these commutes are taking place, and really be able to isolate these work-related commuting behaviors. And so what this might look like this is just commutes or patterns within New York City for a month of January 2019, just as an example, kind of what we're able to see in looking at these commute patterns. So not only we could see, because we're able to develop this network, much like in social network analysis, for instance, we're able to see kind of areas of influence. We're able to see the strength of connections between two places. And of course, over time, we could see how this network changes. And that's fundamentally what we're interested in as well. How are these patterns changing? How are these structures changing between home and work commute activity? We're also using, as a kind of calibration and validation for some of these mobility data, we're using the longitudinal employer household dynamics survey of the census. This is the loads data as an incredible resource, which also provides, from a survey base, kind of this idea of a home and work connection. So it doesn't give us the number of trips or any of that component, but it does, through this survey-based information, it gives us, for each worker, it gives us information about their home CBG and, of course, characteristics of that home CBG. So this provides a lot of important information that we're going to be able to bring into our modeling. And then one last component of an important data processing aspect that we're bringing in as well is using land cover database. So this is a kind of a satellite imagery classification system for the entire US. I guess this is a better way of showing it, which characterizes different areas at a 30-meter resolution based on their land use. And so why we're using this is because we have the census block group geographies, of course, that we're using. But to calculate and to understand kind of employment densities and worker-related, the density of workers in a given area, we wanted to characterize the area in those census block groups based on its use. So in this case, we're able to look at a census block group and characterize the amount of developed area within that, so that when we're calculating our worker density numbers, we're actually just looking at the developed area within that CBG. And of course, this is more significant because we're looking across the US, and of course the varying densities and sizes of the census block groups across the US. So this provides a little bit more normalization as we're trying to define worker density within a census block group or within an employment center. And then just some other data that we're working with, of course, American Community Survey data, which provides a lot of socioeconomic and demographic data. We've pulled crime data because this is one thing we wanted to look at. We've looked at various political measures as well, so political affiliation and voting behavior, and then various geographic data sets. Okay, so in terms of our methodology, one of the first and most important things was to define what an employment center is. So this was actually something that initially we weren't necessarily focused on as something that needed to be established and needed to be focused on. But when we're trying to find these definitions of where employment centers are, or where these hubs of employment are, traditionally it's been the CBD, and that CBD has been defined very broadly in terms of how that's characterized. Going back to 1980s kind of Census Bureau report that provides, census tracts for CBDs across the country. Now, there have been newer ways. There's been many other approaches to trying to define employment centers, but we thought this was an opportunity to try to use this commuting behavior data that we have, this mobility network data that we have, to really combine that with the LEHD data to identify employment centers as a way of identifying employment centers in cities. So we have a multi-step process, but I will just kind of walk through at a high level how we establish this, and then kind of show some of the results. So the first process is we have our network, and we use something called the PageRank algorithm. So this was actually something developed by the by Google founder Larry Page to look at the influence of a node in a network. And so you can imagine the importance of that for social network analysis, for instance, or even for, a web page in terms of the popularity or the significance of a web page in a search. But here we're using it based on this commuting behavior activity to look at where are the CBGs of most influence, of most significance in terms of the amount of activity, the amount of connections into them. So this gives us a measure of the relative importance, if you will, or the relative activity in a CBG. So that's where we start. And then we look at those CBGs based on the characteristics of employment within them. So we look at the number of jobs and the density of jobs. So we have a cutoff of density of 10 workers per acre, which is a kind of a traditional kind of reference point for looking at kind of employment areas. And we are able to then aggregate the CBGs that have been identified through the page algorithm and that meet that threshold, and then aggregate them based on the connections between them and the congruity, between them. So our final cutoffs include this 10 worker per acre, as well as a limit of, or a minimum of 10,000 jobs within the employment center boundaries. So you can see on the top right, kind of looking at the result for Lower Manhattan. And then the map below just shows the number of identified employment centers across different states across the country. And just to validate kind of our data on workers based on the cell phone data versus the census reported LEHD data, we just do a quick comparison, a quick correlation analysis here. And the correlation is very strong, about a 0.85 R squared. And so we're capturing through the mobility data about 8% of the reported jobs within the 803 identified employment centers. And this is roughly what we would expect, since the mobility data captures plus or minus 30 to 40 million devices a year, so roughly 10% of the population in the US. And so we're kind of roughly capturing that same proportion in terms of workers within these employment centers. And here again is that same map that I showed earlier, but kind of highlighting where these employment centers are. And just to give you a kind of a zoomed in view of what this looks like in terms of these connections, these are employment centers within the New York MSA, and of course, kind of a visualization of where of those commutes are originating from into the employment centers. Okay, so first step was to identify employment centers, so we could actually look to see what our unit analysis of, or what our unit of analysis is. Because we didn't want to just focus on the CBDs. We knew there was something else going on. And a big part of what we were interested in is understanding kind of the spatial patterns of these changes in commute behavior. So another important aspect was to define core and periphery employment centers. So core being more akin to the traditional CBDs or the traditional downtown areas of a city, and then looking at the secondary or peripheral employment centers. So we had to do this. I mean, we did this systematically, where we looked at the distance for each MSA from its CBD to the furthermost employment center. And then we adjusted the distances, or adjusted that scale, or normalized that scale, because of course there's MSAs of varying sizes across the US. So we had to adjust this to provide some kind of cutoff in terms of defining what a core or a peripheral EC is. So we ended up saying that any employment center within 25% of that normalized distance from the CBD is a core CBD, and anything further than that is a peripheral CBD. So, I mean, obviously there's lots of different ways to look at this. I mean, we could have used other thresholds, but this was one approach that we took to begin to try to compare kind of this, almost the kind of primary, secondary, or this core versus peripheral impacts. And from all this data, we of course the key focus that we're looking at is trying to understand the change in commuting activity and commuting behavior over time in these or to these employment centers. So that's where we developed the commuting change index. And so what we're looking at is the work-related visits into each employment center as a proportion of the total work-related visits. So we're normalizing the data as we go. And this is an important component because there are variations in, of course, how many devices are being included in the data how many cell phone devices or mobile devices are being included in the data over time. So to normalize for those changes in just how these data are collected, which are completely out of our hands, we kind of looking at this proportion of work-related activity into an employment center versus the kind of global, if you will, or the total employment activity or work-related activity more broadly. And so then we were able to calculate this over a change over time using a baseline year. And so we were using the 2019 as the baseline year. And then we're able to calculate this on a monthly and annual basis over time. So, and as I mentioned, we had 803 employment centers. We drop a few just because of outliers in terms of this kind of distribution analysis here. And this just kind of shows you what these commuting change index values look like across the US and just on average over time. So you could see the dramatic decrease, almost the initial impact on average of the pandemic period on these work-related trips into the identified employment centers was approximately 50%. So really significant impact, a significant drop that has slowly recovered, as you can see, back up to about a 30% reduction as of the end of 2022 in terms of a recovery of those work-related trips. But of course, the variation among employment centers and across MSAs is what we're really interested in. And then finally, we're able to kind of combine this into trying to think about can we develop a resilience measure for employment centers? So can we use these data about how commuting activity is changing and work-related activity is changing in an employment center? And can we use the pandemic as a case study here based on the last few years to look at both the impact that occurred and then the time to recovery, if there was a recovery. So we use this conceptual version of the kind of traditional resiliency curve, where we're trying to look at the initial impact from the kind of COVID, the initial COVID period, the initial pandemic kind of period where most of the stay-at-home orders were initiated, and then we look at the time to recovery, if it recovers back to pre-pandemic equilibrium, or if there is some kind of more permanent shift away from equilibrium in terms of the total work-related commuting activity. So that area on the right side, this area R, gives us a measure of kind of the relative resilience between employment centers. And so while we're somewhat time constrained, obviously with our data at this point, since we're only going up until 2023, the hope as we continue along and get more data, we're able to expand this and really understand recovery patterns much more clearly. And then hopefully this will provide some lessons for us going forward, planners and others going forward, to think about the relative resilience of an employment center to other exogenous shocks. And so as we classify this, as I mentioned, because of the time limitations of the data that we're working with, a majority of the employment centers did not recover to, pre-equilibrium levels within the study period. And this is, either a function of it just wasn't enough time, or because there are kind of persistent changes that mean that those employment centers won't be returning back to those pre-pandemic levels. But we're able to kind of develop a quadrant of the impact versus the time to recovery. We could see kind of areas that had low impact and quick recoveries, high impact, quick recoveries, et cetera, low impact, long recoveries, high impact, long recoveries. So trying to understand this kind of relation between time to recovery and the initial impact in terms of the initial shock of changes to commuting activities. I'll skip over that one. Okay, so some of our results, just to give you a sense of what this looks like in terms of the data that we have and that we've collected for each of these employment centers. So this is an area around, of course, Washington, D.C., area around the mall in D.C. On the right side is this network of where these commutes are coming from. Kind of the blue showing 2019, and the red is showing 2022. And of course, there's overlay in these, so it's not visually, it's somewhat difficult to take too much out of this, but it gives you a sense of what the network looks like. And then below that is the CCI, that commuting change index, and we could see kind of both the dramatic impact, almost an 85% impact in terms of work-related commuting activity, and how that is very, very slowly recovered through kind of the fourth quarter of 2022. Obviously, this has ticked up quite in the last year or so, quite a bit. But I mean, for the period of these data, you could kind of see what the implications are here. And so what we wanted to do was we pulled all of these different data sources. This is obviously a lot to look at, but just to give you a sense of the broad categories of the data of the kind of variables, the kind of characteristics that we're interested in and we're able to extract. We have data on the employment center itself. So that's kind of the area, the share of the developed area, how close it is to the CBD, the resident population, other things of that nature. We can then look at the characteristics related to the workers that travel into that employment center. So we know the kind of job mix, for instance, whether office jobs, public sector jobs, private sector jobs. We can know something about the demographic characteristics of the workers themselves. And then through both the mobility data and the census data, we're able to characterize the characteristics of the home location. So where people are commuting from. So we could look at the income of where people are commuting from, demographics of where people are commuting from, that commuting distance and time, education, for instance, political affiliation. So all of these things are coming into our modeling here. And so this is just the descriptive statistics of some of these variables for all of the employment centers, the core and the periphery. And we could see, quite a number of differences here. They're not highlighted, so we might have to come back and digest some of this. But certainly looking at differences in commuting distance and commuting times, relative differences in income and other demographic characteristics. But just to try to make some sense of all of this, we wanted to, at the outset, I mean, part of it was just thinking about some questions and hypotheses to test. So we wanted to go through this process of identifying the employment centers, creating these mobility networks and commuting networks, characterizing and collecting all of these data so that we could look at the changes in the CCI and the commuting activity across these employment centers over time, and try to look at associations or relationships in terms of hypothesis testing about what can explain some of the observed differences. So here are some of the ones that we have explored. So we were among, I think, more significant ones, of course, looking at the size of the MSA. We were looking at the commuting distance. We were looking at the mix of jobs, for instance. We were looking at crime rates. We were looking at cultural amenities in the employment center. We were looking at the mixed use and the uses within the employment center. The size of the companies in the employment center on average. Work-related kind of worker-related characteristics. All of these things were things, and of course, political affiliations of the people working in the employment centers themselves. So all of these things are things that we looked at and have been testing. So there were some initial just kind of Pearson correlations. So looking at just the kind of bivariate relationship between that commuting change index and some of these variables. We see some interesting things pop out. As you would imagine, the share of private sector jobs is negatively associated with the commuting change index. The share of jobs in larger companies also average commuting distance becomes an important piece of this. And then a few others that have highlighted out in terms of political affiliation of voters or of workers, and the amenities within the employment center themselves. So that's this POI density. So we're looking at points of interest within the employment center. And so I'll just show you some examples of some of these plots of the relationship between CCI and some of these key variables. And this is looking at the commuting distance, excuse me, and showing kind of this negative relationship between the change in commuting activity and commuting distance. So as commuting distances and times grew longer, there was a larger drop in commuting activity to those employment centers. And this somewhat holds to across core and peripheral employment centers. And so this is also looking at the private sector jobs. We see this negative correlation, private sector jobs with the commuting change index. And then interestingly, one thing that came up was this point of interest density. So this is a measure, I'll just spend a second on this. This is a measure of the cultural, infrastructure, if you will, of an employment center. So restaurants and bars and, gyms and those kind of things that might attract people to an area for reasons other than work or for reasons kind of around work. And interestingly, this is not associated with, this has a weak negative association, at least in this kind of bivariate relationship with that commuting change index. Part of this was just the impact initially to higher density, larger urban areas. But this also has some impact in thinking about, well, if we increase cultural amenities, these kind of amenities will attract more people to come to work. And the answer, at least from this, is that may not hold. But we'll get back to that in a second. Another strong and persistent finding was the political affiliation of workers. And kind of this is measured by who they voted for in the congressional elections in 2022. Has a strong correlation between those voting for Democratic candidates and a decrease in the commuting index, and we'll come back to that as well. And then the share of minority population in the residential in the home locations as well was associated with a negative commuting change index across the employment centers. So this suggests that minority populations, or at least residential areas with larger minority populations, were hit harder in terms of the changing in commute activity. So those are all just bivariate, so one-to-one relationships. So those don't control for all the things that we need to control for, right? So obviously at the very outset, we would say that some of these relationships may be different in larger cities versus smaller cities and coastal cities versus interior cities, for instance. So we have, of course, had to account for all of that. So we looked at just a more traditional kind of OLS regression model to try to highlight out what became the most significant here. And we do see, again, the political affiliation is very important. The kind of the share of the population in the residential area with higher education. So people with higher education, for instance, younger workers, these are associated with a lower commuting change index, controlling for all other factors. And certainly, of course, a major contributor here and an important, very significant factor was the share of office jobs in the employment center. So obviously, employment centers that were more office focused really took a hit, mainly because of the substitution effect and the ability to work from home. We could assume as one driver of that. And so the ordinary least squares regression is fine. It provides a nice linear relationship across multiple variables. So it's a tried and true approach to controlling for kind of various influences or factors or characteristics or variables kind of influencing the variable of interest. But we also wanted to run a gradient boosting model. This is a kind of more of a nonlinear machine learning technique that allows to capture more complex interactions between variables. And what's useful in this case is that since we don't have an elasticity as we would with the linear models, what it does, it gives us the what's called the feature importance, or the significance of that variable and its impact on the outcome of interest, which is the commuting change index. So if we just look at the most important features, the political affiliation comes out again as the most important. Now, I'm going to highlight here that this doesn't necessarily suggest a political divide. What we're capturing here may be a function of the significance of the stay-at-home order that was initially ordered or initially implemented, and of course the response to that stay-at-home order. And these are things that are, of course, difficult to measure. Many people have attempted it over the last few years, but that behavior is somewhat difficult to distill and to capture. But we do see that this relationship holds, and this is significant because one of the things that we have found is that initial impact, so the initial decrease in community activity, persists over time. So the larger the initial impact and decrease in that initial COVID kind of stay-at-home period persisted, and it took longer to recover, if at all, for employment centers that had larger initial impacts. So we see that. Of course, the office jobs is another important one. The share of the jobs held by male workers is also a component here, and that may be a function of the nature of the jobs. The share of the jobs requiring higher education also, and then the size of the MSA was negatively associated with the commuting change index over time. So just to give you a kind of a sense of what this looks like in terms of some case studies, we looked at kind of breaking up the employment centers or binning them based on this change in the commuting index over the time period. And then we started to just highlight, like, what did some of these look like on the ground? So what were we actually talking about? And so we look at the top and bottom, or the highest and lowest CCIs by both employment center and by MSA. And you could get a sense here of kind of, especially looking at the MSAs, kind of where the most impacted were versus the least impacted. So some of the least impacted were, as you can see here, Texas, Florida, Alabama, some of the southern states, as we know, some of the Midwestern states to a lesser degree. And then the most impacted tend to be the coastal cities and the kind of Northeast region as well. And so just to give some examples of what this actually looks like, this is an example of an employment center that did relatively well over the time period. So is in that top category. This is Burlington, Vermont. And we could see that even though there was a relatively significant initial impact, a reduction of almost 80% in the kind of to the maximum level of decrease in the first few months of that pandemic period. Over time, the CCI has increased and surpassed its kind of pre-pandemic values, and so there could be lots of reasons for this. I mean, all of this work we've done so far is very much about correlation, not yet causation to any great degree. But of course, we do have this kind of move towards places outside of the core cities, especially in the 2021-2022 period. And so that places like Vermont and these types of employment centers benefited from those types of residential migration shifts. And then, of course, one that's been talked about quite a lot is looking at the financial district in San Francisco. And so this is kind of one of the areas, one of the employment centers that has been hit the hardest. It's still, as of the end of 2022, the commuting change index was still only 0.23, so roughly 77% lower than the pre-pandemic period. And you could see from the network graph above, the blue were connections and commutes in from 2019, and then you could see what's happening in 2022. So far fewer commutes coming in, both in absolute number and also from kind of where those commutes are coming from. So I think I will just kind of wrap this up, open up for questions. Um, just some conclusions to try to distill, some of the important factors from all this. And again, there is a lot of things that we wanted to look at. This is very much a work in progress. This is the first time we've been kind of presenting on some of the work that we've done. So, please keep that in mind, and we look forward to feedback and ideas on where to take this. But for us, I mean, an important piece of this was really thinking about how do we use these really interesting kind of geolocation, the mobility data, to better understand this question of what is the impact of work from home, what is the impact of just the kind of changing work relationships in cities, what will the impact be on the spatial structure of cities, what will the impact be on traditional downtowns. So being able to quantify this, being able to connect kind of not only activity in an employment area, employment center, but also where that activity is coming from and how that is changing is going to be, I think, a critically important a thing to understand for planning and for city planners and others going forward. But we do have, of course, findings from all of this, and so certainly larger cities with that more significant initial impact and decrease in commuting activity experience more persistent challenges to recovery over time. So these are the areas and the employment centers that have struggled the most. And so, as we mentioned, that mean or average impact initially was almost a 50% decline. So very significant, but that varied quite a bit across the employment centers. So some of the things that impacted the change in the CCI and the resilience measures included, as one would expect, the share of office jobs, the share of public sector jobs, which also tended to switch to remote work much more readily. Commuting distances were an important factor, and this has come up, I think, in many other studies as well about looking at commute times, how the areas with longer commuting distances and commuting times faced a harder, I think faced more significant decreases in commuting activity, as one might expect, right? People began to shift towards opportunities either to work from home or to work more closely to where they were living, or they're shifting their residential area and they moved to a place where they could be closer to work. And of course, lastly, that initial impact, the implications of the stay-at-home order at the very beginning were very significant in terms of their persistent effect. Overall, core employment centers faced even greater declines. So on average, 10% more than what we define as peripheral ECs. So we do see this effect on more traditional commercial business districts, on more traditional downtowns. And we see this to some extent too with the MSAs, with kind of some of the larger, more established, MSAs seeing greater declines in commuting activity to the employment centers than smaller and more regionally dispersed MSAs. And so one of the takeaways is that this work reinforces some of the discussions about either a kind of a donut effect or a hollowing out of the traditional downtowns, but that's not the entire story here. In that we're seeing not only is there necessarily a shift, perhaps away from the traditional downtowns and commercial areas to some of the peripheral areas, but there's also a shift that's happening in terms of the relationship between where people are living and where people are working. So it's not simply, this is a plight of the downtown cores. There is kind of something that we're in the middle of that can't be, that is still obviously still ongoing in terms of this population migration, not only regionally across the country, but also within MSAs and within cities, and that then has an effect on working activity. I'll point out there's a number of limitations to this analysis. I mean, the data that we're working with is very exciting. As I mentioned, it covers pretty much every census block group in the country, and is extracting data from roughly 30 to 40 million mobile devices a year. But at the same time, the way these data are collected, creates some uncertainty and some errors. It changes in terms of how they're collected over time. and also kind of how workers are captured in that data and how work-related trips are captured in that data. So these are things that are somewhat out of our control because they relate to how the data themselves are actually collected. So we just have to balance, as with everything, kind of the potential value from these data and their shortcomings and their limitations and potential biases in the data themselves. I've been somewhat careful, although really the interest here, of course, that we've had is what is the impact of work from home and remote work, but we can't necessarily equate one-to-one changes in commuting activity and changes from work from home behavior. Obviously, there's more going on here than just everyone who used to be commuting is not commuting, is now working from home. That's not the entire story, and that's what we're working on now. In part is to see kind of how those work-related trips changed. So perhaps looking at someone used to commute into a downtown area in New York, and now all of a sudden they're commuting to an area on Long Island. So the job didn't go away, or that commute didn't go away. It just shifted in terms of kind of the spatial organization of it. And then, as I mentioned, kind of measuring the restrictiveness of the initial stay-at-home orders is really key, of course, to understanding kind of the persistent effects on commuting activity in employment centers. But measuring the restrictiveness is somewhat difficult and somewhat endogenous here because we measure the restrictiveness based on the mobility data. And so that limits our ability to have some more objective measures, perhaps, of kind of the restrictiveness of the measure itself, and then, of course, the behavioral response to those restrictions. So as we move forward here, we are continuing to extend the analysis as we're getting more mobility data in. So for 2023 and 2024. As soon as the 2023 LEHD data comes in, we're able to validate a lot of what we're doing with those data. So that will be, I think, of huge importance. And then, as I've been talking about, measuring these changes in the network structure over time. So we have employment centers that we estimated based on 2019 data. We can then look at those employment centers for 2023 data and start to see how those are shifting and how the relationship between the home and work commuting activity is shifting as well. And that will tell us a lot more about, kind of what this is going to imply for the spatial structure of cities. And we are putting together an interactive visualization tool so that people can go and explore these data, download them, query them as well. So you could go in and kind of understand these and looking at the changes over time for specific employment centers or compare across different employment centers. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Constantine. There were several questions that came up, and I think one is on everyone's mind, and that is the shift to I wouldn't say mandate, but a recalling of workers to the office 5 days a week, and how would that play out in the study that you have now?
Yeah, I think that will be really interesting to see. And I think and kind of highlights, hopefully, I think maybe a use case for what we've been doing is that we will be able to track what the effects of those types of mandates to return to office actually look like. Now, I think there's been a lot of discussion about what the extent of those is going to be. I think there's a lot of there's been a more permanent shift, I think, to some percentage of work from home that has increased from pre-2020 levels. But I think the idea with what we're being able to do here is we're able to actually measure that effect and measure that effect at a very high resolution. So we're able to drill down to individual employment centers and individual areas to kind of track what the implications are going to be. So it will be, I'm not going to make any predictions on what that is going to look like, but certainly I think with what we have, we can start to do that.
Okay. And then I know you said you're waiting for the 2023 data to come out. Can I, as a non-researcher, make the correlation that there will always be about an 18-month lag then in terms of the analysis of the data and the recognizing of potential shifts or trends? Or is there a way to jumpstart it so that as a developer, I know not necessarily say which POIs, but I could then start looking at it from a policy or public transportation mode?
Yes, of course. So the mobility data actually are updated quite regularly. So we happen to be pulling them every month. It's possible to get them at a higher frequency than that, since there's different pathways to getting this data. With the 2023 LEHD data, which is what I mentioned as a validation, that's the survey data that the census performs. So that data is always going to be lagging just by virtue of how the Census Bureau collects and then disseminates that information. So that was just to provide another validation for our analysis. But based on what we have already, we were able to do that validation and have a high degree of confidence in terms of the capture rate in terms of the work-related visits that we're capturing at about that 8% of total. That will persist. So we can start to think about doing predictions based on the models that I've shown in terms of what might the impact be, going forward.
Okay, there are two questions there that are somewhat related, and it really is the shifting and commuting and its impact based upon the type of industry you're in. So if you're in the technology, telecommunication, tech industry, will that change behaviors? And really, was there an impact from COVID on it, or really was it just a natural migration that has happened and potentially will continue to happen with that and other industries?
Absolutely. So I think from our results, I mean, we looked at different occupation types, and certainly this kind of office job category is including professional managerial type positions, which would encompass kind of tech related jobs. So I certainly think that there's certain occupations that are predisposed to working from home. Obviously, if you're a mechanic, you're not able to work from home. If you're an essential worker, these aren't really options. So the mix of employment and the mix of occupations with an employment center is a key factor in terms of what the impact is on this type of commuting activity. And so we saw that quite dramatically in terms of the impact from kind of office related jobs, which are more can more viably switch to a work from home. And you're right. I mean, absolutely, there was a trend already to kind of remote work that was existing kind of pre-COVID. That was in many ways simply accelerated, in terms of what was happening because of the policy response to the initial phases of the pandemic. But I think we're only going to see more of that, right? I mean, as we go from kind of AI being a buzzword to something that actually is impacting our day-to-day lives, impacting the way we do our jobs, we're only going to see, I think, more of a shift to remote work or more flexible work arrangements for people in kind of those types of occupations, those types of kind of office related occupations.
Okay, and the final one, which is probably on everyone's mind, is your advent system that tracks with our cell phones or
Yeah.
mobile devices where we're at work versus where we're at home. How does it really understand where home is and where work is?
So as I mentioned, there's lots of different data providers and companies who are collecting this type of information. It is a bit overwhelming when we think about all of the different technology companies that are able to provide extract all kinds of data on our use patterns and our behaviors. But the way these types of operators work is that based on applications that are pulling location for whatever reason. I mean, an obvious one would be like an Uber app or like a Waze or a Google Maps where you're looking for directions and you're giving your location from your device. So those are being aggregated. So the devices are pinging a location or providing a location to the data providers and to the cell phone providers at some frequency. So these data providers are aggregating that information. And so, for instance, to your question about how do they know what a home location is, they could see a device that's pinging in a particular census block group, and it's located in that census block group at certain times of the night, and it happens to see it in that certain time of the night over a period of weeks or months. And so it just uses an algorithm based on that location activity to say must be its home locate, must be the device's home location. So that's how these data providers are doing it. And these types of data are being used for countless studies. I mean, there's a lot of different return to office measures and return to work measures that are using these types of data, as well as using like card swipe data and other things as well.
Okay, we're currently out of time, but I do want to thank you as well as the audience. Just so everyone who's participating understands, Constantine and his team are working on publishing this information, and there will be a white paper that they will provide to us, I would say within the upcoming week. So until then, we do ask for your patience in terms of seeing this information within the LAI site, but we do really want to thank you for everything and look forward to updates on this information. And as you said, access to some of this information that you had provided on your presentation here.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, it's been great to work with you all, and we look forward to any other questions or feedback and other ideas for how to extend this study. So thank you so much.
Thank you.